collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
On this week's programme, we hear about women who were forced to have caesarean sections if they were COVID positive.
Women were forced to have a C-section despite the recommendations by World Health Organization and all large gynecologies and obstetrics associations internationally.
With elections just around the corner, why are Parliament delaying the passing of so many bills?
They need to take into account that the opposition parties will be very reluctant to endorse or accept bills that change fundamentally something in our society just before the elections.
And a science fair with talented youngsters from across the island taking part.
We see that the kids are really amazing. So once you see their work, you cannot believe how many great things can show to us. It's unbelievable.
Regular listeners will know that in the past we have tackled the issue of the high number of caesarean sections carried out in Cyprus. In 2018, out of 31 European countries, Cyprus had the highest rate at 56.9%. That's well over half. And it's something that over the years the Association of Obstetrics and Gynecology has promised to tackle. Well, it's not being tackled at the moment because one of the things that we perhaps haven't thought about in terms of the coronavirus pandemic is pregnant women and the fact that if they're ready to give birth and they test positive, they have been referred to the Makarios hospital and there they have undergone caesarean sections. Now, to talk about this and the fact that they've been lobbying to get this changed is the Vice President of the NGO Birth Forward. She is Iole Orfanidis. Iole, these women have been, in a sense, forced, I think, to have caesarean sections. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. Actually, since the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, we suspected that this was happening, but we had no way to confirm it. So in December 2020, the Facebook page of the Makarion Obstetrics and Gynecology Department actually posted about it and said that they performed, I think it was up to 30 births at that point to COVID-positive women. And as they declared in their Facebook post, all of them were performed by caesarean section for safety reasons, as they claimed. After several protests from Facebook users, they changed that post and they removed the by caesarean section due to safety reasons, but the essence was the same. Women were forced to have a C-section despite the recommendations by World Health Organization and all large gynecologies and obstetrics associations internationally.
Yes, can I interrupt you there? Because I looked into this and the World Health Organization, I think, has issued an announcement that caesarean section should only be performed when it's medically justified and that it's perfectly all right for women who are pregnant to give birth naturally, even if they are COVID positive.
Yes, actually, even more recommended, because imagine a woman who is COVID positive and has symptoms, her body is already suffering. Imagine having to undergo a major surgery when at the same time you're in a condition that, you have to keep coughing. I mean, when you have a C-section, and this is from my personal experience, they tell you not to cough, not to laugh because of the stitches. So it is not only not recommended, it's highly recommended to have a natural birth if possible. So we started campaigning about it. We wrote a letter to authorities. We addressed it to OAE, OKP, to the obstetrics department of Makarion, to the Minister of Health, and started going public with this issue. So more and more women came to us with their experiences, and it was obvious to us that what they underwent was an infringement of their human rights.
Well, and their chance and indeed their right to choose the method of birth, assuming that it wouldn't be harmful to mother or baby. But let me ask you as well about the issue of breastfeeding, because correct me if I'm wrong, but some women who have caesarean sections find it very difficult, if not impossible, to breastfeed. So what about that?
Well, the evidence is sometimes contradictory. Some evidence says that C-sections do not affect breastfeeding. Other research says that it does affect it in some way. It seems that perhaps one should look if the C-section is scheduled or if it's an emergency C-section. The point with breastfeeding during COVID for COVID-positive women is a whole different one, because also in the beginning of the pandemic, we realized that the protocol followed by Makarion was an extremely strict one, and it meant that women had to be separated from their babies for 15 days, and women were instructed to not to breastfeed, actually. So imagine trying to establish breastfeeding with just pumping and expressing and dumping, or I'm not sure if they told them to express and then give it to the baby after sterilization. But still, it's very difficult to establish breastfeeding in any of these two cases. So we campaigned about that in different letters, and we managed to have the protocol changed. And right now the protocol says that if a COVID-positive woman gives birth in Makarion, then they are obliged to let her know about the pros and cons of rooming in, which means that the baby will be in the same room as the mother, and that this will benefit, of course, breastfeeding. This increases the chances of the baby contracting the virus, but still the benefits of breastfeeding are so many that World Health Organizations and the NICE guidelines and all these international guidelines recommend rooming in for the COVID-19 positive mother and the baby, as long as the mother takes all protective measures and wears a mask during breastfeeding and everything. The
virus isn't passed through breast milk, is it?
No, exactly the opposite, actually. Research has shown that the virus, with women who are COVID-19 positive, actually gave antibodies through their milk to their babies. So imagine the benefits to the baby, that even if they do contract the virus, they will already have the antibodies, and the mother's milk will give them the way to fight it.
Right, now let's talk about the ventilation in the hospital, because I did read somewhere that one of the reasons we were told this was happening was the fact that it's a central ventilation system, and therefore if a COVID-positive mother was straining, breathing out, doing all the things you do during a normal birth, that could get into the ventilation system and contaminate the whole hospital.
Right. So the counter-argument to that is that a woman who undergoes a C-section has to stay in the hospital for many more days than a woman who gives birth vaginally. So a natural birth, with a natural birth, I mean, this is done all the time in the UK, in the NHS system. Women give birth and they can go home the same day, even the same day if doctors judge that it is safe. So with the C-section, they have to stay in the hospital for at least 3 or 4 days, coming into contact with the personnel there, who has to go and take care of them. So again, the risk of contamination to the personnel is high. Since 15 months or after the campaign, they found a way to have a natural birth room for COVID-19 positive women. Well, this means that where there's a will, there's a way. If they wanted to do it from the beginning, there probably was a way, but it was just stalling. I mean, you said it yourself in the introduction of your show. We have so many C-sections that right now I think that we have a C-section culture in Cyprus. It's more common to have a C-section rather than a vaginal birth.
Yeah, well, it looks like they've at least sorted it out for now at the Makarios Hospital. And have you spoken to any women who've been in since the methodology has been changed and who have been able to give birth naturally?
Actually, no, we only know of 3 cases, but no one has come into contact with us. We don't know who these people are. If they are listening and want to come into contact with Birth Forward, we'll be very happy to hear about their experience and publish it if they wish on our Facebook page. We only came into contact with the women who were obliged to have a C-section before the natural birth room for COVID-positive women.
And how do they feel about this? Because the other thing, of course, I suppose, is that their husbands weren't allowed into the birthing room during a C-section.
Yeah. Unfortunately, husbands not being allowed, or I should say birth partners not being allowed in the C-section operation room is a policy of Makarion followed for years now, although we do know of cases of women who, with the help of their lawyer, managed to overcome this. But that is part of what they underwent. We're talking about isolation during their postpartum period. The reports that have come to us are quite devastating. The women were truly traumatized. Let me just give you an example. There was this lady, I think she was actually the first lady, who gave birth in March 2020 with an obligatory C-section. It was her third baby. The other two were vaginal births and very easy births, actually, and she was forced to have a C-section. So this woman, we are in very close contact with her. She's still having nightmares that they're waking her up and taking her baby. Other women who were, it was their second baby, the first vaginal and the second forced C-section. They didn't manage to breastfeed. They didn't manage to bond with the baby as much. And because they have the experience from the first baby, they know to compare. So we're causing traumatization completely unnecessary.
Well, we were. Let's be fair. They've changed it now, thank goodness.
Yes.
And
Okay.
so that women who are referred there, and we should say that I think we did at the beginning, Makarios Hospital was the reference hospital. So a lot of women who had been going to private gynecologists and obstetricians were actually referred to the Makarios Hospital. Do we know whether this same policy happened in the private sector?
It was the policy of the Ministry of Health until very recently. After our letter in December 2020, a letter from the Ministry of Health was sent to all clinics, in private and DSE clinics, stating that they now had the right to accommodate for vaginal births for COVID-19 positive women if they wished so, provided that they followed all protocols. We don't know of any case of a private hospital or a YESI hospital, a maternity clinic, that actually went through with a vaginal birth for COVID-19 positive women. All of them were referred to Makarion. What we do recommend for women in their pregnancy, if they do contract the virus, is if they're not at the very final stages of their pregnancy, like 40 weeks plus, they should just wait for the 15 days of quarantine to pass, and then they can give birth naturally or try to give birth naturally at the maternity clinic of their choice, because after the 15 days they can get the release paper from their doctor, and it doesn't matter, they cannot transmit the virus to other people.
So that's good news. That's nice to have good news for a change. Iole Orfanidis from the Birth Forward NGO in Cyprus, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
We all know, I think, that elections are not very far off here in Cyprus, and in the last week or so, it's rather extraordinary that Parliament seems to have either decided not to discuss or certainly not to send to the plenum for a vote several bills that have been pending for quite a while. One on local government reform, one on the reform of the judicial system, and also they've scuppered government plans to further support businesses during the pandemic. Is this all because elections are just around the corner, or is there more to it? I'm joined on the programme this week by Yannos Katsouridis. He's Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Nicosia. Yannos, thanks for joining us. Maybe I sound a little cynical with that introduction, but it does seem to me that every time we have elections in the offing, Parliament starts to delay things even more than they're usually delayed. Is that fair?
On the one side, someone would say, yeah. I think when we contextualize, and you have contextualized well with the elections, it always comes down to what it looks to favor one party or the other party or the government who's in office. So I wouldn't say that it doesn't make sense for what you have said, that it does play a role, definitely. But I think that beyond the elections and the fact that no one wants to see that the government, for example, in this case, is gaining something from these bills, I think there are other aspects as well, beyond the power games, beyond the equilibrium of the power in the parliament. There is also an issue which regards the responsiveness of the government each time. You have correctly pointed out that there are bills that have been outstanding for a long time now, but they have been amended by the opposition parties. The government was aware that they did not agree with the bills as they were submitted. They were withdrawn for several months, and they were resubmitted just a few days before the parliament closes for the election. So I would see a point there that opposition parties might not want the government to be credited with these bills, but on the other hand, the government has not been so responsive with regard to the amendments and the modifications that were asked by the opposition parties. They could have submitted earlier these bills so that they would take off any of the excuses that might be put forward the way they are done now. Because at the point, and with only a few days before the parliament closes, I think it's only natural. I mean, despite the fact that they have been discussed in the past, I have seen the opposition parties saying that the government has not changed anything with regard to the essence of their previous observations and comments on the bill. So I would say that there are two sides in the coin there.
Do we actually know what, if any, changes were made after they were first turned down by the plenum?
Okay, with regard to the bill on the local elections, there was a change, definitely. The government has responded with a referendum, pan-Cypriot referendum, an island-wide referendum for the changes. The opposition has asked for a local referendum, so I don't think how we can reconcile this very easily. With the judicial reforms and the support to the businesses, I have not seen the bills, to be honest. I have seen the arguments put forward by the government and also by the opposition parties. The opposition parties say that essentially nothing has changed from the previous bill, that it was submitted and withdrawn. The government did not respond actually to that. So I guess, in essence, nothing has changed with regard to that. But they have been resubmitted, probably because they want to press before the parliament closes that they pass the legislation and maybe have something to show for the elections. But to my understanding, at least the two bills, the judicial reform and the support to the business sector, they have not changed, at least substantially. The reorganization of the local councils, there is a change, a significant change with the referendum, but it's not in the direction that the opposition parties would agree.
Well, it does seem that when we use this system, you're very unlikely to get very much passed at all, surely.
It will always come down to the equilibrium between parties and those who support the government or not in the parliament. The current government has certainly lost the backing of the parliament, which they enjoyed in the first couple of years. Now they are in a very difficult position because they need to seek for shifting alliances constantly. And this is not an easy thing to do, particularly just before the elections. Even those parties that, for example, the parties that they voted the annual budget a few months ago, they were reluctant to endorse these new bills because it was done in a way that it thinks that the government wants to present something just before the elections. So they were not willing to, not just the two or three major opposition parties, but it was the other parties as well who seemed reluctant. So the government must take into account constantly, and regardless of which government is in office, they need to take into account that the opposition parties will be very reluctant to endorse or accept bills that change fundamentally something in our society just before the elections. I think it's only natural.
Do you? Well, we're running out of time, but I'm just beginning to wonder whether or not Parliament is there purely for the sake of the parties represented in Parliament, or whether Parliament is actually there to pass legislation that is quite patently needed in terms of things like the reform of the judiciary and our justice system, which is notoriously slow, and things like having 30 municipalities on an island the size of Cyprus. This has been going on for years.
Yes, this is why I expected that the government would fare much better in this regard. They should expect that the way the parliament is structured, the way they do business there, you should have taken into consideration this aspect. On the other hand, you are right to point that the parliament should pass this type of legislation, of course, provided that they agree, because sometimes ideological or political differences are quite substantial. I've had the experience of working for 9 years in the parliament, so I know that it's not always about differences that come about just because of the elections. There are substantial differences in this important legislation, and you need to seek for compromises, but it's not so easy to do it a few days before the elections and before the parliament closes. So it's something that you need to take into consideration constantly.
Which I'm afraid, if you look back over the history of Parliament, is very rarely done, even straight after an election. But there we have to leave it, Janos. Thank you very much indeed for enlightening us. And we'll wait and see what, if anything, happens with the new Parliament, or whether the new MPs want to start from the beginning all over again to read through everything, as so often happens. We've been talking to Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Nicosia, Yannos Katsouridis.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
A fascinating event is going to take place on Monday and Tuesday, although it has been in preparation for some time. It's organised by the Cyprus Institute and it's called the Science Fair 2021. Now, the interesting thing is it's aimed at school children. My next guest is Head of Events at the Cyprus Institute. She is Haris Ifestou. Haris, thanks for joining us. This isn't the first time, I think, that the Cyprus Institute has organised an event for school children to become more familiar with science.
Actually, this is not the first time that this event is taking place. It was initiated in 2019. And we had a lot of participation. Of course, it was a different structure because we had all the school teams being at our facilities. Then we organized the same thing for 2020. Again, the participation was massive, but due to COVID, we had to postpone it. And it's taking place now, as you mentioned before, on 19th and 20th of April.
So what does it actually entail? Because you have 3 categories, I think, for the different school ages.
Yes, actually, we invited students from all schools around Cyprus, private and from public sector as well, ages 9 to 18 years old. And we created 3 categories which covered primary schools, secondary schools and high schools. So what we ask from the students is to prepare a maximum of 10 minutes video where they show and they present something that they do at school, a scientific experiment, some research work. So we were very flexible and very open to what they were about to show to us. So this is an idea that came to us because we want to encourage young people to be really into science at all levels. So the idea is that we reversed the standard procedure of having adults, researchers from various universities or organizations to show their scientific work. So we wanted to reverse this and give the chance to students to show to the public about their scientific exploration.
Right, I think I'm right in saying that actually the Cyprus Institute Committee will do 50% of the points for the higher school students and all of them for the primary school. Now, has it been well publicised on social media? Have the children done that themselves? How's it working?
Well, we loaded everything on social media on Facebook, so their friends, their relatives, their classmates, everybody could vote for them.
So can people still vote, or has the voting closed?
Well, the voting closes today at 12 noon, and people can still vote until that time. The Science Fair has its own Facebook page, so they can look at that page and they find the list for secondary school and the list for high schools. So they go and they choose whatever they watch on any video they want, and they just like. Each like is a vote. Also, it's worth saying that whoever votes gets the chance to win one of 3 drones that we have as giveaways for this vote.
When you say the Science Fair, I think you spelt it SCY?
Yes.
So people know where to find it. They've only got a few hours to do that to go and vote.
Yes, it's SCYENCE. If you check on the Science Fair Facebook page, you can find all the information and also the links to follow to watch it live on the 19th and the 20th. And at the end of the second day, we will announce the winners for each category and also the second and third runner-up.
Now, tell me a little bit about the other part of this whole science fair, which sounded fascinating, and that was the physics decathlon. What was that all about?
That will be the demonstration of 10 physics experiments with using very simple material. So everybody can create something at home while watching, and then they can answer just a few basic questions, and after the decathlon is over, again, whoever participates in answering the questions that are posted on a specific link is also eligible for another giveaway, 3 action cameras.
Wow. Now, this is interesting because STEM subjects are not in Cyprus very well attended, or certainly haven't been in the past. Is part of the idea behind this, Harris, to get children more interested in science, technology, maths and so on?
Yes, we want to promote the idea of students in Cyprus to be more into science. And so they have this as a strong part in their agenda. And from what we see from all the participations, we see that the kids are really amazing. So once you see their work, you cannot believe how many great things can show to us. It's unbelievable.
Can I just also ask you, how can you be sure that the experiments that have been entered in this competition, were they supposed to be the brainchild of the children, or could the teacher set a task and the children then carried it out?
No, I mean, it's very obvious. If you watch these videos, you can automatically understand that the students are really very well aware of what they are showing and what they explain, because if you remember, Einstein said that if you understand something, you can explain it in a very simple way. So you can see these little students, like 9, 10, 11, 13, 14 years old, that they can understand very well what they are talking about. So they learned and they know what they are talking about. That makes it obvious that, of course, they are guided by their teachers, but I am sure that they understand and they show passionate about what they are presenting.
Which is brilliant news for future generations and for the future of our country, because this, of course, is where most of the jobs and the innovations are going to come from in the coming years.
Before we close, I want to thank our sponsors, which are CETA, Medochemy, and XN.
Fair enough. Anything that helps these things occur is always welcome. Thank you again.
I thank you as well, and I hope you will enjoy watching the Science Fair 2021.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.